Ex-prisoners, what is the saddest thing you've ever seen in prison? "17-year-old kid was in my block. His name was Israel. He had been kicked out of his grandma's house a few months prior for doing drugs, so he was living on the streets. He got picked up for package theft. He was only in for 30 days, but he was enjoying every minute of it. Because he was young and a generally good dude, people looked out for him. I taught him how to play spades. At the end of the 30 days, he didn't want to get out. He didn't want to go back to life on the street with no food. He was planning on doing something to get himself back in there, but I tried convincing him that's not where he wanted to be. I told him he needed to go talk to his grandma, quit doing drugs, and try to get a job to help her pay her bills and keep him out of trouble so he could get his own place sometime soon. He heard me, but I doubt he was listening. If I had to guess, he probably got himself locked up again, but I sure hope not. There was a guy whose girlfriend broke up with him while he was inside. So just before we walked out to go to lunch, he had slit his wrists. His cellmate had to explain to the officer that he didn't do it, he did it to himself. Edit, wow. I can't believe this blew up the way that it did. I appreciate all of the upvotes. I have plenty of stories from being on the inside which are either funny or very depressing to think about. I wasn't exactly in prison, it was the county jail. I used to have a bit of a drinking problem and landed a DUI. It was a ruralish Wisconsin county, so like 90% of all the inmates were drunks. One guy we had in there for his fourth owie, but he'd been sober for 20 years. He got it because he had throat cancer. He was spaced out on his pain meds when he got pulled over. The cancer had eaten his larynx away, and he had to use one of those electronic wand voice boxes to talk. There was some fuck-up involving the paperwork for his cancer meds, so the asshole in charge of the block wouldn't let him have any of them for the first few days. He was throwing up all over the place, and the rest of us inmates had to take care of him and clean up his vomit. Eventually they got his med thing figured out and he did the rest of his time, about 2 months. 3 weeks after he got out, we saw his obituary in the paper. We also had a nurse who came around to give everybody their meds in the morning and evening who quit because the officer in charge of the jail was constantly bitching her out for being too nice to the inmates. She was a really sweet younger lady, I think relatively fresh out of college. Basically, she thought that we were already at a low point in our lives, so we deserved some kindness. An officer didn't agree and he started giving her a hard time about anything he could. I think the incident with the cancer guy was the last straw for her. Just all the people with severe mental illness that shouldn't be there. And in an immigration jail, I saw a Korean die from AIDS-related issues as the jail wouldn't supply him with any medication. In the same jail, a friend ended up with multiple cancer tumors caused by lack of treatment for prostate cancer. The jail refused to bring him to the hospital for over 2 years. By the time he got the diagnosis for the prostate cancer, it had already spread to his liver, lungs, colon, and bones. Terminal. He died about 2 months after I got released. Not a ex-inmate but a ex-CO had an inmate who got some bad news in the form of his mother passing right as it turned Christmas Day. It was midnight and we wouldn't be serving chow for a good long a while, and the day rooms were all clear of inmates, so it was a tad odd to have to escort a guy down to the LT's office. I was dismissed as soon as we arrived and he was sent back alone. This guy was a troublemaker, always acting disrespectful to both us and the other inmates. When he returned, I figured I was gonna have hell putting him back in. Instead, he calmly walked back to his cell, never said a word and didn't even look around. We checked on him multiple times and nothing happened on my shift. Found out when I came back in the next day that he had hung himself in his cell with a towel while his cellie was at rec and the officers were busy in another wing. I remember the worst part was getting the call to escort him down, cause when they called it had just turned from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day, so for Christmas he got another night in prison and he lost his mother. A guy we worked out with found out his dad killed his wife, mom and their child, then killed himself. He went to his cell for a while and after like 40 minutes he was screaming for help. Stumbled out of his cell with his wrists all cut up and also cut up his neck real bad too. Unfortunately, he didn't make it more than a few steps out of his cell before falling and going unresponsive. That was almost as rough as when my best friend's brother decided to blow the back of his skull off in the room next to us. I was in for 12 years, South Florida, got out in 2019. Older gentleman and fresh and was constantly crying and screaming about his dogs and how he misses them, won't be able to pet them, just absolutely breaking down. His roommate got sick of the screaming and crying and ended up breaking the guy's hands and sawing his fingers off so he couldn't pet his dogs anymore. Truly some horrific stuff. I knew a guy who was never in trouble in his life. He was working in the automotive industry in Michigan and lost his job. He fell behind with child support payments and ended up doing time in jail. His very first night, his two cellmates got into an argument because one of them couldn't find his bear claw snack. They finally stopped arguing and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, he was woken up by the guy beating the guy he accused of theft. He literally beat the guy to death. Apparently, he had gotten a hold of some kind of pole or stick. The entire cell was just completely covered in blood. They end up finding out that the guy he accused of stealing it didn't steal it after all. I'll never forget the fear and look in Guy's eyes when he told me what happened. Hanging out one day in the law library. All of a sudden, some kid who was fresh came in minding his own business, and just started reading something. One of my boys who was also in there, mind you I'd been locked up for over a year at this point with this dude, he was chill and in there for coke dealing, got up, walked over to the younger kid, and beat the living fuck out of him. Like, not just knocked him out. I'm saying literally beat the life out of him. Blood flying everywhere. The kid was on the ground and dude just kept smashing his face in, it was like literally caved in. I got up and just stepped back and watched so I wouldn't get jumped by the COs when they came in. They literally dragged this lifeless kid away and cuffed the dude I knew. I saw him once more before I got out, and I asked him what TF happened that day. All he said was I felt like fucking somebody up. Needless to say, I've had serious trust issues since then, and since being locked up in general. Seeing that literal 18-year-old get beat to death in front of me was pretty fucked. There was a guy on the yard convinced he was gonna be transformed into a chicken for his crimes later in life, crazy really. My brother had 3 gold teeth. They were ripped out in the first few months of being in prison. He said he lost them in a fight, but a guard told us that he was probably held down and had them forcefully pulled out, judging by the damage to his gums. There was a person who went to prison and cried all the time. He never spoke, but after a while it became clear that the officer forced him to confess that he had killed a person, otherwise he would rape his sister in front of his eyes. He confessed and received a life sentence. We are in a very conservative country, English is not my first language. My ex-boyfriend was in jail for almost 3 years. I used to visit him every Saturday. There were lots of families there, in the visitation room. Imagine a sort of warehouse with little tables and chairs. There was this woman that would sometimes visit her husband and give him handjobs under the table, sometimes she would sit on his lap and ride him for a while. Right next to her 2 little kids. I will never forget those kids' faces, staring at the wall, trying to ignore what their parents were doing. The guards would mostly ignore it because the guy was apparently a big shot drug dealer and had lots of influence. It was absolutely disgusting and humiliating for those kids. My ex would scold me for staring at them with disgust. He didn't want to get in trouble with that guy. So messed up. Not as messed up as your horror stories, but it broke my heart to see kids in those situations. In Everglades Correctional down near Miami, was in the box for positive drug test and seen white boy being molested by bunkie up against door screaming for his life, and at night nobody is coming, SMH, still hear his screams. A 57-year-old man on a life sentence high on spice, synthetic psychoactive cannabinoids, crawling around on the floor screaming because he can see his dead mother towering over him looking at him in disgust. Not a pleasant thing to see. Edit, especially when you're stuck in a cell with him. Edit 2, doing the same drug I've mentioned above, a 22-year-old man ended up flooding his cell, setting it on fire and killing himself whilst on the drug, 2 months before finishing his sentence. Another one is where a guy sliced his fucking dick in half, and again set fire to his cell, because the drug made him think erections are evil. So yay, stay away from spice. As a kid, I went to juvie, kid jail, for accidentally setting some woods on fire, bonfire out of control, situation, and my cellmate was only a few years older than me. He was a super nice, laid-back guy. We got along great, and even sort of became friends while there. I was just a kid, so I didn't really ask any questions about different colors of jumpsuits and people's reasons for being there. The day I got out, I found out he was in there for murder. Apparently he got really tired of his stepdad physically abusing him and he killed him. I never really knew all of the details, but I can tell you that when talking to him, he seemed like a good kid at heart. Had things and people that he cared about, things he wanted to do, interests, etc. The guards obviously must have known, but they were always super nice to him, noticeably so, even more so than other inmates. I always wondered what happened to him. Edit. Wow, lol, I appreciate the karma, didn't expect it. No, I don't know his name, and have not tried to find him because of that. This took place in Florida, during severe drought, and we were already fighting a bunch of fires intentionally set by arsonists. They definitely took it pretty serious. 2 kids that I thought were my friends pinned the whole thing on me. I absolutely learned my lesson lol. He was very cool, polite, and got along with everybody. I couldn't have imagined it being enjoyable for him, but I only knew him that brief period. I went to county for about a week in the middle of nowhere, Kansas on a drug charge. I was 19 years old, scared shitless. It was a room with about 4 communal picnic benches and 2 rooms on either side with about 6 bunks in them. I noticed one was full, and the other had just 1 guy in there. So not understanding the situation at all, I went over to the empty bunks and a guy grabbed my shoulder and just gave me a hard look that said no but without saying a word. Then I noticed the other prisoners were camped out in corners on their mattress. I did the same. Found out quickly that the solo guy was in for crime against a child. I have never heard such as an ass whooping, more. That night, I just covered my ears and stared at the wall. How did I get here? And the sobbing and pleading. I was bonded out the next day. Edit, a couple people have asked. This was in 1992, my spring break of college freshman year. I was driving to visit a friend of mine in Wichita. I never had to serve time, first offense, good lawyer, college kid, etc. I got extremely lucky. 2 things. There was an old Italian man, transitioned from cane to wheelchair the 4 years I was there. Hunched over, palsy, half-blind, had bought paid inmate caretakers to watch over him. Yes, that's a thing in federal prison. It's not inhumane, it's one of the best-paying jobs to have, actually. He was in his early 90s and dying from cancer. Feds would not grant compassionate leave because he'd been an important capo in the mafioso, back in the late 70s. No, I don't remember his name. Then there was this guy, maybe early 30s? Probably high-functioning autistic. No friends, prison is hell if you don't have at least one person to hang with, spent all his time listening to Catholic masses on the radio and all his free time either walking the track or in the leisure library, still the radio, all the time. During visitations, his mother, who came every time as far as we could figure out, would pet him. Literally pet him, stroking his arm or hair or back. You could tell it was very comforting for both of them, kinda jealous sometimes, because that sort of contact wasn't permitted except the guards looked the other way for this guy. We all knew he was ASO, but it wasn't that kind of place, and even if it was, even lower on that totem pole is those who prey on the helpless, and, man, was this dude ever helpless. No one felt anything more than pity for him. Not a prisoner, but I worked in a prison for about 2 years as an admin. A lot of sad stuff happens all the time. Many times, the inmate's family visits turns out into a big shouting event, and the inmate goes back to their room feeling depressed because that was first time in months they had seen their family. There was one time where a guy was waiting for his mother and sister to visit him. The family had booked half an hour time slot, and the guy was in the waiting room. But they never turned up. I actually saw tears in his eyes as the visiting hours were over and he was told to go back. Our prison also conducts GCSE English and math classes for inmates. One of the inmates had been doing a lot of revision and preparing for his GCSEs, for almost a year I assume. On the day of his exam, he heard that his partner had committed suicide, and he was mentally traumatized to sit in the exam. He lost his partner, missed his chance to appear in the exam, and lost a bit of his mind as well. There are countless small stories that I've seen, which is extremely sad. When I narrate this to people, there's very little sympathy towards them. Had a stint in juvie way back during COVID. A 13-year-old girl was the only other person I could talk to since her intake day was the same as mine, social distancing BS. Jesus, her story was intense. Long story short, she was in there because of a brutal fight with her druggy mom. She had two choices: lose her only family member to jail and have to go into foster care, or lie and take the fault so she would be the one locked up. Genuinely almost brought me to tears. She had so many cuts and bruises. When I was young, juvie, I was 15 or 16 at the time. Most of us there were older teens. 11-year-old kid was brought in for throwing rocks at one of his teachers' homes. Had a older fat guard who worked there. These were generally civilian guards, given we were juveniles. Well, this guy, named Travis, started being weird with the kid. At first kid was like any other 11-year-old. Happy-go-lucky. Travis got really handsy with him. At mealtimes he was like actively rubbing on him. We all saw it, was a lockdown facility, so we weren't let out of our cells much either, but we all witnessed it. Guy was like rubbing his back, touching his leg. Within a few days, kid's whole attitude changed. We all knew Travis was molesting him, even though we couldn't prove it. I knew a guy who was very kind and in prison for just a parole violation because he stole something. He was a homeless guy. He was a bit goofy and had schizophrenia or something, but a really nice guy. Anyway, he got sent to SEG for some reason and the guards ended up beating him to death there. I believe the guards who did it are in prison themselves now. Can't believe that happened. Rip Larry. Edit. Here's the article: https://www.tspr.org/tspr-local/2023-0323/3 guards at Mount Sterling Prison sentenced in beating death. Was in with someone, let's call him Carlos, was up for review serving a dime and he got a new roomie who tried to clap his cheeks. Carlos had no choice but to stick him, and he added another 5 years to his term when he was likely going to be free that year. From what we understand, he did tell the guards and review board that he was defending himself from being raped, but not sure what the outcome was other than he added more time. Edit. Update. Wow, didn't realize how many likes this got. Thank you all. I just asked my boy who stayed in the same block with Carlos about how his release date, and Carlos did in fact get out on time in 2017. The new roommate had a reputation and many other DAs in his paperwork about other rapes in prison, which came into play for his review. Edit. Update. I was serving 3 to 5 for conspiracy to fraud and aggravated assault 3. Ended up serving 2 years in Arizona for good behavior and participation. I didn't do it. Lawyer fucked me. Shawshank Redemption. I was once stood up for a visit. My friend booked it and didn't show, so I had to wait in the holding cells whilst everyone went on their visits. After an hour, a guy from my area came back off his visit looking visibly shaken/upset. He went on to tell me that his girlfriend and mother to his kids had just told him she had terminal cancer. Sadly, she died not long after. This was like 12 years ago. To make matters worse, the guy's face popped up on my Facebook the other week as he was murdered. Made me think of them kids, possibly adults now, parentless. I was working on servery, so I was out of my cell every day all day. One day I was told by the screw to check on the cells on the ground floor. I opened one of the door flaps and this guy, he was standing in the middle of the room, with shirt off, crying. Then proceeded to slash both his wrists. Called help, he made it. But not long after hung himself.